Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. The 10th novel from Colm Tóibín, the Booker Prize-winning author of The Master and Brooklyn, is an intimate portrait of one of 20th century's most intriguing literary figures, Thomas Mann. The Magician is an epic family saga set across a half-century spanning World War I, the rise of Hitler, World War II, and the Cold War. Tóibín has crafted a complex but empathetic portrayal of a writer in a lifelong battle against his innermost desires, his family, and the tumultuous times they endured. Again, the new novel is The Magician. It is a great pleasure to welcome Colm Tóibín back. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm wonderful. This novel is beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. It's an amazing life. I find it fascinating when writers write about writers. And obviously, it's something that you're interested in. It's something that you're passionate about. And the inner workings must just fascinate you. So what was it about Thomas Mann that said, okay, I can spend some time with this guy?
It begins, I think, with reading the books, Thomas Mann's books, novels like Buddenbrooks, Death in Venice, Magic Mountain, Dr. Faustus. And I read these books in my late teens, early 20s.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of readers, they'll know what I'm talking about. But I say those books that you picked yourself, that you read with friends, that you were crazy about when you were 19, they stay with you in a really funny way throughout your life. What's interesting about Thomas Mann is we knew so little about him, in, say, even in the 70s. That, I realised that Buddenbrooks is a really autobiographical novel going back 5 generations of his own family in Lübeck. But as regards what sort of man he was, he seemed scholarly, buttoned up, stiff, a very serious German, father of 6, and a most respectable fellow. And it was really only when his diaries appeared, and, in his will he said his diary should be published 25 years after his death. So he knew these were coming. And these included his secret erotic homosexual longings and dreams, and also a sort of unease politically and an unease socially. It wasn't as though he was confident in the world. It wasn't as though he was an implacable enemy of fascism all his life. And obviously he was a monarchist during the First World War. And also he would go and give a reading or indeed a lecture. And there could be 1,000 people there in a big German hall. And in his diary, it would be scholarly and serious about Schiller and Goethe and the German tradition and Beethoven. And anyway, he would go home later and he would write in his diary, "Young man in third row caught his eye. He noticed me. I gazed," and that would be for him the pinnacle of the evening, rather than some marvelous point he'd made. Seeing really the gaze thing was so important for him, the watching, the catching of eyes, and they were all young men.
I would assume, I don't know this, of course, but it would seem to me just alone the fact that he had these homosexual thoughts was not what you found as interesting as the overall ambiguity of the man.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That it isn't as though I'm interested in this closet homosexual. I'm interested in this great man who really contained a myriad, who could not be easily pinned down, who changed his political position in a way that was remarkable, from a monarchist really up until about 1918, to becoming a very serious Democrat in the 20s, and then in the 30s and 40s, really an implacable enemy of Hitler. I think all the more powerfully because he too had supped at the fount of anti-democratic politics. He knew what it was, and he made his way out of it. And but actually what I'm really interested in is his marriage. Is what would a man like that, if he married a very clever woman and a thoughtful, intelligent person who too herself contained a myriad, what would that marriage be like? And so the novel is more than anything else a portrait of a marriage.
It is a portrait of a marriage, and a fascinating marriage, because really this is a woman who is wry and very, very funny, and has a twinkle, and is very interesting in how she deals with her children, and also how she deals with her husband. And you pretty much lead us to believe that they had some sort of pact.
Yeah, there was an agreement that he would not socially or indeed domestically embarrass her. In other words, he didn't go out at night cruising. He didn't do those things. And she, in turn, understood that she'd married a man who was complex in many ways. You see, it's hard to imagine or hard to remember. People think the 1920s in Germany was the roaring time. But Katja Pringsheim, Thomas Mann's wife, her grandmother was the most famous feminist in Germany. And so, sexuality was something for her that was novel, interesting, fluid, and suggestive. And she was, family were assimilated Jewish. They were tremendously rich. But her father was a professor of mathematics as well as having all the money. She was one of the first German women to study science in a university. Her brother was studying conducting with Gustav Mahler in Vienna. I mean, they were a high bohemian, high bourgeois, and they had a beautiful house in the middle of Munich. They entertained wildly and lavishly. And for them, of course, a young writer from Lübeck who'd written this famous book called Buddenbrooks, he was gold for them. In other words, he wasn't rich. He wasn't from a bohemian family. But he was the biggest, I suppose, find culturally. And she threw her lot in with him, had 6 children with him, all of whom were interesting in ways. But the first 2 were wild because when the 20s happened, they were exactly the right age. And they slept with whom they liked, said what they liked, wore what they liked, and wrote what they liked.
I would think keeping track of the children in reading this novel is funny and difficult sometimes. And I thought to myself, and please excuse my language, but I thought, wow, writing about this many kids must have been a...
Look, I kneel down every night and I pray. And what I pray for is I ask God, please listen to me. I need you now. I know I didn't need you before, but I need you now. Please, in my next novel, no one can have 6 children. They can have 1 child or 2. But trying to do 6 and trying to say, well, obviously I remember their names, but trying to say, where is Michael now? I haven't mentioned him for a chapter. He needs to come in and do something.
Yeah.
What? Where is Monica? She's always causing trouble. Where is she? So that business of if you're a juggler and you're really used to 3 balls and you're doing marvelously, everyone says, what a marvelous juggler you are. And then someone gives you 6. So that's really the problem. So I had to really, really work at this.
The name of the book is The Magician, and it's a term that he originally uses sort of as a joke, and then the kids pick up on it and start calling him the Magician, which they do with more and more derision as they get older and he gets older because they don't think all that much of him.
Yeah, I think like a lot of famous men, he was not famous in his own house. In other words, that his children laughed at him, insulted him, and 2 of them in a way tried to outdo him, Erika and Klaus, who were the 2 oldest ones, and the third child, Golo, became a better scholar than his father. And so, yes, in the domestic sphere, it wasn't as though if the magician spoke, they all listened and nodded their heads. It was they interrupted him as soon as he opened his mouth. And so that's an interesting part of the story. He's in his study working. He has enormous authority in that silence of the study, with his pen in his hand. Once he goes out of his study, all the noise is made by others, by his wife, by his brother-in-law, by his own brother, and by his children. He is almost the watcher, the silent one, the one who notices things, and the one who I suppose soaks in experience. But he's not a noisy man.
You write, Elizabeth ran her finger down her list of questions. Why did you marry him? She asked her mother, pointing casually at her father. Katja didn't even hesitate. She spoke as though she had prepared her reply. Of all the possibilities, present, past, and future, your father was the least preposterous.
Yeah, she was a sardonic young woman in Munich, and she had no time for idiotic young men who wanted to flatter her or who wanted to show how clever they were. Young men of her own age, perhaps even of her own class. And of course, she was going to inherit a lot of money. So there was that too. So, she was studying science. So, of course, he was the least preposterous. Also, in the fact that he was very important for her, his homosexuality, because her father was a tremendous philanderer. And he always had an actress on, around at that time. The actresses were considered sort of sexually, I suppose, adventurous. And she didn't want that. I mean, she didn't want to have a marriage where you couldn't tell where her husband was. So she married a husband who only had sex with her.
Because even the homosexual, we'll call them relationships, weren't really relationships. And in fact, in my reading of your book, it doesn't really go beyond a kiss.
Yeah. That the big thing he had with the boy Klaus Hauser, which is in his diary, is that he kissed him. And he talks about lips that I have kissed. And, I suppose this is a man starved for sexual relations. And he's certainly, he's old-fashioned. It's not as though he wants to go to bed with another man and spend the night in another man's arms. He isn't advanced enough for this in a way. And so that's as far as it goes in his diaries, and that's as far as I went. But of course, if you're building up to a kiss, you can really make the kiss an enormous event for somebody.
Colm Tóibín is our guest. The name of the new novel is The Magician. There's a scene toward the end of the book, and Thomas is late in life, 70s, and his wife basically sets him up with this waiter, and it's fascinating. It was almost like a present, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in 1995, 3 biographies of Thomas Mann came out in English. And it really opened up a lot of space where you could think about him. And among the information in these biographies was that at the age of 75, Thomas Mann, one of the most famous people in the world, fell in love in Switzerland with a fleshy Bavarian waiter. He wrote in his diaries, I would exchange world fame for time with this man.
Wow.
And he was depressed at the time. I mean, the biographers were so good that they found the waiter. And they interviewed him. He said, "Oh yes, you remember Thomas Mann was terribly nice. He was married, and he was very cheerful about. I mean, this event took place. Thomas Mann's wife and daughter were worried about him being depressed. He was just melancholy. He was down. They realized he was a new man, just much more cheerful in this hotel, and they realized that encounters with this waiter were really doing him good. Were like a tonic. And so they arranged for further meetings to cheer him up, which I think is a lovely idea. It's such a liberal, tolerant, sweet thing to do. But of course, it's a great drama. If you put it into a novel, I mean, it's just so unusual. It's the last thing you think is going to happen. Because when he starts flirting with the waiter first, his daughter Erica says to him, "Would you stop doing that? Everyone's looking at you."
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. You just said something that I thought was fascinating, that he said that he would give up fame, he would give up even the Nobel Prize, I guess, would maybe include in that?
I think that's what he meant.
But you don't say that in the novel, do you?
No. With that, I thought, I wanted to show it. I wanted the reader to see it. If you spell it out like that,
yeah,
you lose the drama of it. So, there were times when I didn't take a sentence like that. But I allowed a sentence like, and that's very observant of you. I allowed a sentence like that to dictate the scene. But I didn't put it in because I thought it would ruin the scene by spelling out what the scene was doing.
Really interesting that the way you divide the novel through the chapters is geographically.
Yes, he loses Lübeck. In other words, the Manns were famous traders in Lübeck. Their names were up on warehouses.
Right.
And his great-grandfather. And when his father died when he was a teenager, his father's will said that the business was to be wound up. And the mother moved to Munich. So he lost Lübeck. Later on, he would lose Munich. He would lose Germany when he was living in California. So these places became important for him as places he lost. So too, he went first to Princeton. And then he ended up in California. Yes, you're absolutely right. So those places, rather than saying, it isn't in 1935, it's where he was in 1935 that matters most.
You just mentioned loss. Loss is very much a part of this novel.
Yeah, that first loss, he rebuilds Lübeck, which is the town beside Hamburg in the north of Germany, in his novel, which he finished at the age of 25, where he didn't just describe his father and his mother. He went back 3 generations, lovingly describing each thing they did, each way the business was built, how, who married who, famous dinners they had, all the time using a sort of family Bible in which they wrote down each important event as a sort of central moment in the book. But I think the big loss for him was Germany. And that in 1933 he was living outside the country. He was on a trip, basically. And when Hitler came to power, and they told him not to come back in. And so he didn't come back in for 15 years or 16 years. And he began to wander, first in Switzerland, then in France, and then eventually he was lured to America. Roosevelt really liked him, trusted him, felt he was a figure of the center, that he wasn't a communist on one side and he had no sort of fascist connections, and that he was a great man. He'd won the Nobel Prize in 1929. So really, with the help of Roosevelt, he becomes, when the Second World War breaks out, this great figure in America, where he represents a sort of Germany that had been there in the past, the Germany of Bach and Beethoven. And he represents the Germany of the future, because his speeches, which he gives all over America in this faltering English, it's generally the same speech. It's called The Coming Victory of Democracy. And what he wants to talk about is the idea of liberty, is the idea of democracy. I think things that matter enormously now in that same part of Europe. And they were talking about principles. And he stood up very beautifully and eloquently for certain principles that America shared with what he saw the basic German ideals shared, and that after the war there would be democracy and liberty in Germany. There was no Italian doing this at the same time. There was no Japanese writer doing this at the same time. He got as many as 5,000 people to attend his events in places like Oklahoma and Ohio. It was quite an important thing to build public opinion in America, not merely to defeat the Nazis, but to believe there was an ideal involved which would be represented in a Germany that would come after the war. And that's what Thomas Mann came to represent in America in the 40s.
It is amazing reading this, because I was just thinking of it even through your perspective of he is a very popular writer. Thousands of people are showing up to see him. He's got chauffeured cars. They're coming up. That people are cheering as he's coming in, which he seems to enjoy. Right? He seems to like.
Oh, he does. He
likes
likes all that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's all a lot of pomp and circumstance that comes with this. He's getting what, 25% of every book that's sold.
Yeah.
What happened there for authors?
Yes, it is. I was actually in a publishing house in Germany saying, what year did authors stop getting 25%? Because Thomas Mann is on 25%. You see, he lives incredibly well. His books are selling really well in America. Every civilized household in America has Thomas Mann books on the shelves as examples of the sort of what they aspire to. And he built a house in 1942 in Pacific Palisades, which is a really, really beautiful house. And some of the other German exiles, of course, were living in poverty. And he always lived a high bourgeois life.
When it comes to his brother, let's talk about his relationship with Heinrich, because Heinrich is also a writer and a successful writer in Germany, but does not have, obviously, the crossover success that Thomas has in America. There seems to be great love between the two, but also great strain.
Yeah, I think anyone who comes from a family where there are two brothers or has two sons, I think understands this idea that what happened when they were 8 and 9 never leaves them for the rest of their lives. And Heinrich was older than Thomas. And, you know, he was a different sort of boy. You know, in other words, he was much more, I suppose, masculine. And later on, he was the one who left the family earliest and was always certain what he wanted to do. He was, from a certain point, quite a left-wing figure and remained left-wing and was pacifist in the First World War, or at least was anti-militaristic in the First World War. And you're quite right that where Thomas Mann's books began to sell in America and in England, Heinrich Mann's books did not. He wrote the novel on which the film The Blue Angel is based.
Right. So
he had a lot of success. But really, by the time Thomas Mann arrives in America, he arrives in sort of triumph in 1938, 39. In Princeton, you know, he's being looked after in every possible way. He sleeps one night in the White House. It's known his relationship with Roosevelt. Poor Heinrich arrives finally, and luckily, because if one more day he would have been got by the Nazis. And he gets out of Europe. He comes with his second wife, who happens to be a barmaid that he's in love with. And she's a wonderful woman. She's filled with life, but she's not the sort of person that Thomas Mann's wife is used to dealing with. In other words, Thomas Mann's wife has no time for having a barmaid dinner, because she's reading all the new books, she's listening to all the new music. Thomas Mann's wife, and poor old Nellie just wants to have another drink. And Heinrich arrives with her, but he has no money, and he gets a contract for a year in Hollywood, but they don't know what to do with him, so he loses the contract. So really, from 1942, Heinrich Mann has no income, and now Thomas Mann has to give a stipend every month to his older brother. And you can imagine what that's like. And, they bring with them many things to America, but including their sense of social importance. So when Heinrich eventually, his luck really runs out, he gets an apartment where the kitchen and the dining room is the same room. He thinks this is the lowest.
That's right.
You could come to. And so that relationship, in a way, there are moments when Heinrich is clearly the most powerful one and the most ideologically secure, the most sexually certain. But all those uncertainties end up giving Thomas Mann, I suppose, putting him ahead of his brother, certainly financially and also in terms of fame.
You do these wonderful things where, in talking about relationships between characters, there's one point where Katya says, well, whatever you do, just keep Nellie away from me. Just when she comes, just do whatever you can do. Just keep her away from me.
Yeah. I mean, Katya's great. She's saying, I don't want to be one of the wives. Could other people's wives be kept away from me? And then her daughter-in-law says, well, what about me? You're fine. You're okay, but don't give me the other Mrs. Mann. Just because we're two women, there's no reason why we should be put together.
And I forget the exact quote, so please help me. But there's a section in the book where basically you say that for the people who are living, for the people in the moment of Germany, he's not as respected as he would be later on and looked at. Is that something?
Yes, I think that he's aware. I mean, all of them are wondering about the future.
Yes.
And there's a moment where Heinrich Mann says, this is about 1948, and they've been in California for the war.
Right.
He says they won't appreciate us. They'll think we've been sunning ourselves while bombs were raining on them. They won't want us now. It will happen in the future.
That's exactly the quote I was thinking of.
And you can just imagine, if the Germans began to feel after the war, they had been ordinary Germans. They had been through so much. They put behind them the idea that some of them had supported Hitler. What they remembered most were the bombs and the burning of the cities and the extraordinary destruction of Germany. And they actually, in their own minds, I know this sounds strange, but in their own minds, they became victims. They just didn't see what other people outside Germany saw. That really, that Germany had caused all this, including many ordinary Germans. But after the war, they didn't see it like that. They saw themselves as victims. And they wondered what people like Thomas Mann and his brother and all the other exiles had been doing while they were suffering. And so that it meant that while people were welcome back, they weren't really. It wasn't as though there was an open arm welcome for any of the exiles.
So as he is aging, he is in California. He's living in this palace, pretty much, that he built. And then the McCarthy era begins. And it's this questioning and people asking the questions of where were you and what were you doing and why were you here and who were you talking to? And so eventually they move to Switzerland. That must have been at that point in your life, after you've moved and moved and moved, to have to do that again in the country that you have adopted must have been tremendously difficult.
His daughter Erica was tremendously outspoken, but she didn't have American citizenship. So she was always liable to be deported. And of course she remained outspoken, and the FBI took a great interest in her. And the FBI began to take an interest in Thomas Mann himself. Now he didn't help this, because Germany was divided now, east-west. And when he went back to Germany in 1949, the Americans said to him, we don't want you to go into the Eastern Zone. It's effectively run by the Soviets. This is a serious matter. And he said, well, I'm German. I live in the language. The language is not divided. I will go where the language is. And they said, no, you don't understand that if you speak on the other side, your words will be censored. And in any case, he went in, he defied them, and he went in to the East. And I think that was the end of his welcome in America. They just couldn't understand why he had done this. He was denounced in Congress. He was called a communist. So his welcome wore out, I suppose, and the McCarthy period intensified that. The FBI continued to call to the house to do long interviews with his daughter and with him. So in 1952, at the age of 77, he decided to go again. And so they sold the house in Pacific Palisades, and they went back not to Germany, but to Switzerland. And that was where he died 3 years later.
One of the things that I didn't get to earlier, and I just want to touch on it before we close our conversation, during the time of the great unrest, of course, the war, of how, I mean, he's at the top of the heap. He is the most successful writer at that point. I was struck by how he helped other writers and poets and artists, and how they would often come to him for aid because there was really nobody else to go to.
Yes, that he certainly wasn't. He was never in an ivory tower like that, and he was always aware of what he could do. There were so many people looking for help, and the Americans were so interested in a way. He was pushing an open door in America sometimes, where with Varian Fry, who ran the Emergency Rescue Committee, the interest was to get as many artists and intellectuals out of Europe. The Americans were great. They wanted Picasso and they wanted Matisse. They wanted the big boys to come, I suppose, to go to Nebraska or somewhere, and paint there. But yet Thomas Mann was very much part of that movement. I mean, he was a very political man by, I suppose, especially by about 1937 or 38. He became a political man despite his natural tendencies not to be one.
Colm Tóibín's new novel is The Magician. It is published by Scribner. Colm Tóibín, what a great pleasure to have you on the program.
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.